in the audience may have received a comment card and filled it out last time. And we asked you for your ideas of what we should offer in our next Buffalo Future series. And the number one response was understanding a little bit more of Buffalo's history. So while it might seem a little odd for a program called Buffalo's Future to be looking at Buffalo's past, it's not so far-fetched at all. Everything that makes Buffalo what it is today and what it will be in the future is based in some way on what this community has experienced in the past. One of the most exciting times was the turn of the century, which we'll call Buffalo Glory Days. We were preparing to host the Pan Am Exhibition. We were positioned as the 8th largest city in the U.S. and we're the 6th busiest water port in the entire world. Buffalo also enjoyed the most millionaires per capita of any city in America. Certainly, if you look at the beautiful mansions along Delaware Avenue, you can easily imagine what they must have been like during that earlier time. And I know partly firsthand because in my first year here as president, I rented a third-floor apartment of one of those mansions while we searched for our house, one of the more historic buildings in Elmwood Village. So the architecture and stuff of this city is amazing. Medaille itself is a big part of the history of Buffalo as well. The college traces its roots to 1875, when the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph founded the Institute of Mount St. Joseph in order to prepare the nuns to teach in the Catholic school system. In 1927, the same year that the main building was built, they expanded their mission to prepare nuns to teach in the public school system as well. And in 1937, we received our first charter from the State University of New York. It didn't take from 1875 from that point in time, but we received our first charter to grant baccalaureate degrees to the nuns to prepare them to be teachers, and so we became Mount St. Joseph's Teachers College. On your way out tonight, in the lobby, in the upper lobby, if you look to the left, you'll see a picture of the students, faculty, and staff of Mount St. Joseph's College in 1937, that historic picture from when we were first a college. Fast forward to 1967-68, we realized that the number of sisters was going to dwindle to a place where it was no longer sustainable to run a college, and Sister Alice Huber and the order decided that it was time to make an historic change. And so at that point, they decided to cede control of the institution to a private board, and they decided to open the doors of the college to lay students. And so that is why when you walked into the main building, above the doorway, you saw 50 years of Medaille, because it was in 1968 that we became Medaille College. Sister Alice Huber was its first president. And I don't need notes for all of those things, so I can skip forward a couple of pages. In terms of history, we have always saw ourselves as a place where college meets career. And we're very excited because we think we're making history this week. Last week we began to roll out a very historic, what we think, scholarship program titled the First Generation Payback Scholarship. What Medaille College is doing is saying that if you are a first generation college graduate at Medaille College, then you have earned a free tuition scholarship for your parents. We are paying it back. Medaille College has grown over the years. At this point, we have over 2,000 students, 1,100 traditional undergraduate students here on the Buffalo campus, and 1,100 additional students here in Buffalo on our Rochester campus and online. And we look forward to growing and growing and growing. We are building an athletic complex deep in the heart of the city because we are Buffalo's college. So let's go back to tonight. We do hope we see you back here for future visits to enjoy what we have to offer. And speaking of that, mark your calendars for October 24th. On that day, we'll be presenting our second Buffalo's Future, focusing on history. We'll be taking a look at the impact of the Erie Canal on western New York. It'll be given by one of our esteemed faculty members, Daniel Casimir, who will be joined by the author of City on the Edge, among others, Mark Goldman. And because I skipped around, I don't know which page I'm on next. Or it's not even here. All right, so Stephanie, can you help me out? Because I don't see the names of the other folks. Page 6, I'm missing page 6.
I got page 6.
Thank you, John. Perfect. That's it. These are the ones. All right. Everything's good. So after Melissa and Doug do their presentation, we'll be joined by a panel of 3 local historians that I'd like to introduce to you now. First is Steve Cichon. Steve is a historian, author who tells the story of Buffalo's past through the news, BN Chronicles, and BuffaloStories.com. Next we have Chris Hawley, Buffalo Urbanist and Preservationist, who you may see from time to time biking around the city. Also on the panel is Mike Vogel. Mike is organizer and founding president of the Buffalo Lighthouse Association. He is the author and co-author of 5 books on maritime and lighthouse history and a participant in the National Lighthouse Preservation Movement. Welcome all of you here tonight, and thank you for joining us. Just as a reminder, we have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please be sure to write your questions on the cards that you should have been provided and pass them towards the aisle for collection throughout the evening. We thank you all for joining us tonight and look forward to seeing you in the fall. Melissa and Doug, the stage is yours.
Really excited to be here tonight, and welcome. And this was already discussed a little bit, but when first meeting with John and Stephanie to talk about the program, I was delighted to learn that the regulars to the Futures series were interested in learning more about the past. And they indicated that they wanted a program to look back, and it makes perfect sense, because how do we find our rooting? How do we think about, it almost sounds cliche because we hear it so much, the future, without really understanding the foundations of where we've come from. I recently stumbled on an essay doing some research by an author and historian, Wilfred McClay. It was dated from 2005. It was an article online. And he sampled an essay from 1882 by Ernest Renan titled, "What is a Nation?" And the passage goes, "The nation, like the individual, is a culmination of a long past of endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion. Of all cults, that of the ancestors is most legitimate, for the ancestors have made us who we are. A heroic past, great men and women," that was 1882, "glory by which I understand genuine glory. This is the social capital upon which one bases a national idea. To have common glories in the past and to have common will in the present, to have performed great deeds together and to wish to perform some still yet. These are the essential conditions for being a people. A nation is therefore a large-scale solidarity constituted by the feeling of sacrifices that one has made in the past and of those one is prepared to make in the future." And he takes it a step further. He also says, "Our nation's particular triumphs and sacrifices and sufferings, our memories of these things, draw us and hold us together because they are our particular sacrifices and sufferings." Again, that passage was written in 1882. When working on history and or researching, one of my favorite parts is having messages hit me like that, as though they were written for our own discovery, as though they were messages for us to find, and they still have relevance in our discussions today. Tonight will be fun and spirited. Doug and I are about to lead you on a swift march through 100 years of Buffalo history. Very swift. And we're really only focusing on some key points because it would just be, we were joking, getting us out of here is probably going to be the problem tonight. How did we become Buffalo's 8th largest city? And then, as we mentioned, our distinguished panelists are going to take us a bit further. We've decided that themes of this location, our people, and innovation are threads that run brightly through our local history, and they're ties that tie this broad story together. So by the time we wrap up, you should see how these 3 recurring themes characterize our unique story. So I'm going to start with Erie Canal. And, all right, so I'm moving the slides where Doug was explaining to you that the remote is like reverse of what it's normally doing. So, yes. So most of you will recognize this. Where are we at? Canal side, yes. And so you see the Whipple Bridge, which is a reference back to this earlier image of the commercial slip with the Whipple Bridge. That's the same location. And of course, you know, canal side has been an interesting proposition for development because very few of the physical remnants are left. And for most of us, we mark that location by where the Odd was. You know, the sacred site of where the Odd was. Many of us don't know where the engineering marvel was. So these 4 images that I'm featuring in this first section about the Erie Canal are all from a book called The Picture Book of Early Buffalo. And I know there's people in this room who have it. Raise your hand. Frank Severance, we just love him. I will mention him at every corner I can. He put together this book, and it really is the first kind of a preservation effort of sorts in documenting sites, because he was recognizing in the late 19th century how much of the history was fleeting and how we were losing some of these landmark buildings. So he went through and tried to call together all of these early kind of images of Buffalo, including photographs. The earliest ones are renderings, because we really have to look to artists to understand Buffalo at that time period. So this particular one is in, you know, that early settlement period of Buffalo. You know, prior to the canal, Buffalo was a span of hardwood forests. I've read in first-person accounts and letters about how dark it was, that you really couldn't even have openings through to the sky because of how heavy the tree canopy was. And it's hard for us to imagine that. There were only 2 routes between Buffalo and Black Rock along the river, and you know, a dirty rocky road called the Niagara. These were, you know, the ways people got around and moved in this time period. And of course, then DeWitt Clinton comes up with an idea for his ditch, Clinton's ditch, Clinton's Folly, and this idea of the Erie Canal. And I think it's one of those things that, because we grew up here, we might even take for granted, but in terms of what we recognize the Erie Canal for in the national story, I mean, it really is the first engineering school of sorts, because as they were creating this canal, they were creating the ways to make it. The technology hadn't even been advanced to a point to move that progress along. So the idea of an all-water route between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes that traversed the Appalachians was not an idea that was unique to DeWitt Clinton. He was just the first one to be able to execute on it. It goes back really to the turn of the century, and even George Washington had expressed interest in the notion of this. So DeWitt Clinton wrote a brochure describing the advantages of the canal, and the idea caught on. And by the time of the state legislature gathering in 1816, over 100,000 people had petitioned for the canal, and that was his concept. And we were talking a little bit before. This is definitely after the War of 1812. This is actually from a Catlin rendering of Buffalo that was in the collection. And what I love about it, again, in talking about the artistic license, you know, we only get an idea that this is an idea of what Buffalo is like, but I love the details of the signage and how the roadways are, because those are our only kind of glimpses in to what this looked like or what this experience was like. But we were talking about the War of 1812 earlier. What do people in the group know about the War of 1812? Buffalo what?
There were only 3 structures that were saved, the rest got burned.
Because the rest got burned. Buffalo burned to the ground in 1812. And so there were only about, less than 1,000 inhabitants at that time, and they had to rebuild. And what's really fascinating to think about is that rebuilding period from 1813 to 1817, when the designation for the canal comes through. That's a span of a very short amount of time to regroup and position themselves for this, for the canal. This image, I don't know if this is a pointer, it does. So here's the canal coming in here. This is the old National Hotel, which was a 2-story wooden structure on the corner. What I love about this rendering is actually a centerpiece in Western New York Heritage magazine some time ago, but this is a rendering really that's capturing this homestead. This is Louis Lecoteau's home, and Erasmus Marshall, who was a founder of the Buffalo History Museum, found this rendering actually in a book that he purchased. And this is one of the earliest images of Buffalo. It's hard to make out in this, but there's actually indications of the Native American community that in this rendering is subtly suggests as that pushing out of what was happening by the burgeoning village being settled along the canal. So this is on the cusp of exponential change for Buffalo. So we know we're in a canal anniversary period now. We're 200 years out from 1817 to 1825 is when the canal is built. 363 miles connecting and following rivers. It looked natural from a lot of the paintings that you would see, but it was really something quite audacious and otherworldly. By the time the canal was completed, and as I mentioned, the engineering marvel that it was, Buffalo, in the time of this image, each successive decade after that, Buffalo's population doubled in each decade, all the way going through to the time of the Pan American Exposition. And that is all based on the impact of the canal. So you can see just a short while later, and this is going into the 1850s, and here's Main Street, how much more Buffalo just exponentially has developed. By the time, so the final cost of the canal was $8 million then. So that's huge. Within 10 years, they had recouped their investments on $8 million. I don't think there's ever been another government-operated project that had that type of return on investment. And Buffalo shared in that wealth from the canal. They had the exponential population growth. And now I'm going to turn it over to Doug, bottom one, who's going to take us through the next few decades here.
I teach 7th grade history. Are you okay if I stray from the mic? Excellent. So as Melissa was saying, as the city grows, we were sort of talking about what comes next. By the way, as an aside, I voted for War of 1812. I would have, but we would have been here really all night. So we were talking about, sort of what comes next, and with the growth of the city at the foot of Main Street, there's a need now. There's a social awakening. In a number of early and wide range of Buffalo history books, there's a map of the Canal District. And of course, I'm sitting here going, why didn't I put that map in? Because I really wasn't going to talk about it. But it shows bars, saloons, boarding houses, houses of ill repute, surrounded by social amelioration efforts. As groups went in to make life better for the women and the children of the Canal District. It's a fascinating map. If we ever get invited back, I will make sure to bring it. But it's sort of that beginning of this awareness that a growing city has this social need. And from this point forward, there are a number of social movements that really impact Buffalo and who we became. Number one, of course, is the Underground Railroad. And I would speak for, I'm guessing, every one of us on the stage that if we all had $1 for everybody who said to us, ooh, my house was on the Underground Railroad, we would be doing the panel live via satellite from the Bahamas. It's one of those things where, as historians, for us to separate any kind of reality from fiction is very, very difficult. And, it's right there in the name. I always tell my students, because they envision some, long subway that goes from Main Street to, oh wait, no, that's ours. They envision a subway that goes from, Baton Rouge to Buffalo. And we talk about the fact underground refers to the fact that it was secret, and that the railroad part's really a fascinating piece. That when they chose the language to disguise what they were doing, they went to railroad terms because railroads were the it thing of the 1840s and the 1850s, the heyday of the Underground Railroad. I always say to my students, if we did this today, we would use computer language. We would talk about, tell the webmaster to expect the tweets at 9 o'clock. And that no one, except my kids in my class, know that I don't speak like that. But in public, that language wouldn't raise suspicion. In the same way in 1850, if I saw Chris on the street, and I said, oh, tell the station master to expect the cargo tonight at 9 o'clock. Everybody's trying to sound, I can say it to you guys, everybody's trying to sound hip. So they're using railroad language, and it allows us to converse in a more open way without sort of tipping our hand. So what do we know about the Underground Railroad in Western New York? Not as much as we'd like. There is one list of station masters. You can find it, it's normally, I've seen it on the UB website. I'm always, my area is Clarence, East Amherst, sort of the eastern edge of the county, because that's where people are always saying, oh, our house, there are no station masters in Clarence. We have one solid document in Clarence history that ties us to the Underground Railroad, though I am certain we were there. And it was a letter from a Presbyterian minister's wife who walked into a barn in North Clarence and was surprised that there were slaves being hidden in the hayloft. Why does that make sense to us? Because we know that slaves moved through this area. They moved through the city, we believe, towards Broderick Park, a logical crossing point. There'd been a ferry there all the way back into Black Rock times. We know that Harriet Tubman moved her refugees, her runaway slaves, through the northern part of the county, the swamps of northern Clarence, of northern Amherst, and towards, into Pendleton, Murphy's Orchard, if you've been up there, to crossing points up in Lewiston. And for a long time we used to teach that she crossed with her runaway slaves at the bridge at Art Park. As you stand on that sort of tilted observation platform, that those bridge pillars was the bridge she used to cross. But it never really sat right, because her recollection, and slaves that crossed with her recollected seeing the mist and hearing the falls, and you can't do that from Lewiston. And about 5 years ago, Doug DeCroy, who edits Western New York Heritage, and Tom Chambers, who's a professor at Niagara University, really dug down and found that that wasn't the bridge. It really was probably the forerunner of what is today the Whirlpool Bridge, Niagara Falls. And in that realm of regional tourism, if you haven't been to the Underground Railroad Museum in the Falls, at the foot of where that bridge was, where we know slaves crossed with Harriet Tubman, it is worth an hour of your time next time you're looking for something to do, if you're like me, after the casino. All right. Another piece of sort of our social movement is Mariah Love. If you see it in print, you're going to say Maria Love, but it's pronounced Mariah. And it's one of those one of those Western New York stories. I pulled a thread on this morning and found she's related to George Carey. They're cousins. I'll show you what George. That's a whole talk about going into the weeds. Who's related to whom? It just makes you crazy. But Mariah Love was one of the social reformer in a different way, talking about sort of what comes out of the Canal District, that need for social support for women and children. And so the Fitch Crash was one of the first daycares, if not the first daycare, in the United States. So for 5 cents a day, women could bring their children and they were tended. She picked up the model from France, and it became really a major part of the social movement as we move forward in Western New York and forward in Buffalo. The building is no longer there. This is a John Conlon photograph. If you know John, he is like the beginning of preservation way back before it became hot and chic. John was out there photographing, documenting, advocating, and so this is a picture of where the Fitch Crash was before it was destroyed. And I don't want to steal Melissa's thunder getting to the very end, but sort of the logical extension, at least within our time block, is Mary Talbert and her connection to both Pan American Exposition and the Niagara movement. and Melissa's going to talk more about the pan, but one of the pieces that is hard for us to come to terms with as historians today, looking back 100 years, is that it's very easy for us to want to judge 1901 by 2019 standards, and especially when we look at the Midway. And those, the exhibitions that were on the Midway, we look at, and I remember when we did the centennial, writing and talking formally and informally about, well, they were racist. And that's, as a historian, that's a problematic thing because yes, in 2019, we look at darkest Africa. We look at the old plantation South. We look at the Indian Congress, and we go, those were racist. But I think that's a little bit of presentism because in 1901, it's a country that was still riven by Plessy Ferguson, where separate but equal was the law as dictated by the Supreme Court. And I think we need to be aware of taking our values and imposing them on 1901 because they were seen in 1901 as having an educational value. What I always say when I present on the Pan Am is this: we would not approach those quasi-pseudoscience, scientific, quasi-educational displays in any way the same way. We're offended with our 2019 eyes, but I think we owe it to the past to look at what that tells us about where the country was and who the country was in 1901. And certainly my interpretation is open to discussion. We can revisit a little bit later. Mary Talbert, part of the African American community at the time, was, as many people, as especially African Americans were at the time, offended by the inclusion of these displays and advocated and pushed the Pan Am Board of Directors to include an exhibit that had been at the Atlanta World's Fair. And this has been it's been an issue because we know that that advocacy was made. We believed for a long time that it existed, and yet when you look at the official catalog, and I went to my catalog just the other night, and it's not there. And so there's always been this back and forth about, is this really what happened to Pan? And I'm going to make a shameless plug for the Buffalo Library System. In May, and not in May, the book to read, everybody reads The Electrifying Fall of the Rainbow City. And that'll be sort of the theme that's coming out of the library system. And so I pulled this, and sort of, I think, good and definitive evidence is in here because Margaret Creighton, who's the author, actually has quotes from the New York Times, the reviewers who went through the buildings and who went through, what's the check, liberal arts? The liberal arts building. And actually saw this, the educational display that Mary Talbert and others advocated for. And what's interesting, the point that she makes in the book, is that while there are sort of reviews by non-African Americans who were underwhelmed by what the actual ethnographic display looked like, she said there were no African Americans interviewed by newspapers at the time, so we don't have their voice. And just to finish my thought on Mary Talbert, because it's not only her advocacy of the Pan, but within 4 years, there are meetings taking place in the Niagara Frontier called the Niagara Movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, and others came to Western New York in what becomes the forerunner of the NAACP movement. And there's a lot of, again, we talk about unpacking the past, a lot of urban legend about that, and did they meet in Fort Erie because the hotels couldn't take them? And Cynthia Van Ness, who's the research historian, or research librarian, the History Museum, has done some really interesting work that it probably wasn't a racist thing. It was probably, there was an Elks Convention thing in the city, and that there may simply not have been room at the end. So it's a very interesting, and again, not the end of the social thread in art history, but certainly kind of where we're looking today. The other piece I wanted to hit on, because and we already talked about Delaware Avenue and sort of that piece, and maybe Chris will get into some of this as well. I think one of the things we overlook, though we talk about per capita millionaires, is the impact that that influx of wealth had on the city in the later half of the 1800s. So whether it's something like, oops, wrong button. So whether it's something like, the Larkin Company, and today kind of our filter for Larkin is either the food trucks at Larkinville or the piers of the Frank Lloyd Wright office building. But Buffalo at that time is embodied by Larkin, who is, on the front edge of mail order premiums, a revolutionary way of marketing in the late 1800s. It gives us, not just John Larkin, it gives us Elbert Hubbard and the Roycrofters, it gives us Darwin Martin, and I'll come back to him in just a second. But that list, which if we're going to get out of here at any reasonable hour, is way too long to go into. But those are names: Joseph Dark, George Urban, the magnates who defined who we were, and in a lot of ways defined industries for an entire country. Brought a huge amount of wealth. It's the backwards button. Brought a huge amount of wealth to this area. And my thought always is that what they did for Buffalo is sort of what the Medici family did for artists in Renaissance Florence. They become the patrons of the architects. They become the patrons of the artists, furniture makers like Charles Rolls. That these architects and artists flourished in Buffalo in the last half of the 1800s because that wealth exists in such a high quantity here. So let me just take you down Delaware Avenue very quickly. This is almost the reverse image of what Melissa was just showing you. This is looking south out of the steeple of Westminster Presbyterian, almost in Delaware North. You'll notice this is the Butler Mansion, this is the Wilcox Mansion. And again, if we start to get into Wilcox's, married to Rumsey's, we'll never make it out alive. But just just to kind of give you some thoughts. This is the Butler Mansion, which ties back to the original editors and owners of the Buffalo News. You've got the Clement Mansion, which of course today is the Red Cross. Clement family connected to Westminster, huge donors to the church. But the thing to understand about sort of these millionaires, I hesitate always to use the term robber barons, because I think that as a history teacher, we use that term when we talk about the Gilded Age. But I would simply suggest that a lot of these people that lived in the mansions on Delaware Avenue simply were connected into all sorts of different and often interrelated business ventures. They owned the stand of timber in Pennsylvania, so they found it profitable to own the railroad that carried the timber to Buffalo. And then they found it profitable to own the bank that financed the railroad that carried their timber from their stand of timber in Pennsylvania. Could we see them as robber barons? Yeah, but there are, so I'm not going to go there. I would mention one other thing sort of about this stretch. I got interested in Buffalo Millionaires years ago when I went to Cleveland, went to the Case Western Historical Society. I said, I have some time to kill. I want to go see the Rockefeller Mansion. The woman at the desk said, go downtown, go find the White Castle. I said, oh, is it next to the White Castle? She said, no, it's where the White Castle is. Cleveland and so many other cities have bulldozed their Millionaires Rows. The only analogy that I can give you is it's like going to Newport, Rhode Island. That is the only other place that I have traveled or aware of where we sort of have this amount of extant buildings from that time. Right? And they gave us these architects. They gave us E.B. Green and William Wicks. They gave us, because Melissa's sitting next to me on the stage, I would be remiss to not say George Carey, who, as I said, was related distantly, they're cousins to Mariah Love. I found that because in doing my research, his firstborn daughter was Mariah Love Carey. I'm like, that just can't be a coincidence. And it's not. They gave us S.M. Lyman Johnson, who gave us the Electric Tower. For my neck of the woods, they gave us a arts and crafts clubhouse for the Automobile Club of Buffalo, and that's a whole different story for another time. But I'll leave you with kind of this thought. So William Wicks of Green and Wicks had this lovely house, quiet northern Buffalo suburb. And I've always wondered what he must have thought when one day, in the early 1900s, he must have gone to his study and looked out at the new structure that was going up across the road. And for a rather traditional Beaux-Arts firm, what must he have thought of this? And yet, this is the thing that's bringing us back as a city. We're fortunate to have both E.B. Green, William Wicks, and, as Frank Lloyd Wright said, his Opus. So that wealth is what they wanted to showcase in 1901 when they called the world to come to Buffalo, to the Rainbow City.
I think I'm going to move now too. All right, so now we're in Buffalo 1901, and so we've just marched through this whole century, and what are we looking at here? Do you recognize anything? What? Erie County in Sheldon Square. And so this actually is not from our collection. This is in the public domain. And I love it. It's a panoramic view. And so what is happening in Buffalo? And it comes back to those same things that we were talking about earlier. The themes of transportation, location, the people, and the innovation. So Buffalo on the cusp of the Pan American Exposition. Does anybody know when the Pan Am was actually supposed to be? 1899. But something happened that prevented the exposition from starting in 1899. What was that? Spanish-American War, exactly. So they originally dedicated the exposition to be on Cayuga Island. And McKinley came here and did a groundbreaking in the whole business, expecting that the exposition would open in 1899. Now, we had to compete for this exposition. It was like the Olympics. You had to basically put your hat in the ring. And what did Buffalo have going for it? Well, it had all these things that we've already been talking about. We had our location. We were 1 day's travel. Now think about this. This is one of my favorites. And again, this is actually on envelope caches that they used to advertise the exposition at that time. We were 1 day's travel of 40 million people in 1901. Before airplanes, we were 1 day's travel. And that was a huge selling point for Buffalo. And not only was that a huge selling point, but Buffalo was, we talked about the wealth as a theme, but in other expositions, there was always a leveraging of funds that was expected by the host community, not unlike the Olympics, and it's the same type of competition. But Buffalo was particularly cocky about where they were at, and they actually refused government subsidy, which would come back to bite them. They would refuse government subsidy going into the exposition. So what's interesting, and there's usually always somebody in a talk about the Pan Am who will think that the electric tower that was in Doug's is the electric tower from the Pan American Exposition. Pan American was situated in North Buffalo, north of the building, the History Museum, on 350 acres between Elmwood on the west and Delaware on the east. And when I was talking about envelope caches, this is one of them. So one of the extensive marketing campaigns, kind of a modern marketing campaign, was done largely with mail. There were not only individual envelope caches, like Bark & Company had a whole series of envelope caches that they would send out to all their business mail to advertise the exposition was coming. This is another version of one of those. Madeleine Rumsey Carey, Spirit of Niagara. That was bilingual. It circulated in over 1 million copies. She won a poster competition to have her image become the iconic image of advertising the exposition. This view on the right is actually in that planning phase, and I love to, the Pan Am is, and unlike my esteemed colleagues up here, I'm pretty much a one-trick pony, the Pan Am. I'm a generalist about lots of things, but I am an expert about the exposition. And what fascinates me about this is by taking a look at expositions, and the Pan Am or expositions in general, President McKinley said when he was here, expositions are the timekeepers of progress. And I think he sums it up so well. You can look at these expositions and you can find out a lot about what is happening in the world at that time, as Doug already mentioned. In particular, you can find out about the innovations. And at the Pan Am, this image is actually in Rochester at C.Y. Turner's studio. This is before the exposition is created. If you've been to the museum, you have seen this model of the electric tower. This is in his studio, and these are all of the people working on the color design for the exposition, which actually, the color design was supposed to be reminiscent of the concepts of social Darwinism. And the idea of the most savage and primitive colors, the bright colors, were on the perimeter of the grounds, with the pinnacle being the white electric tower. That was ingrained in the design concepts of the exposition, going back to a lot of what Doug has already remarked about. These folks back here, they're working on a three-dimensional model of the Pan American Exposition to define the color plan. There were at least 3 of those made. It's pretty extensive for a 6-month endeavor. This is one of my favorite views. This is actually taken from the porches of the Psychiatric Center. We have 2 views like this that were done a day and a night view, and they were labeled and come into our collection. The photography at the exposition was actually a concession. You had to pay to take pictures, so there aren't a lot that are not by basically exposition sanctioned photographers. So it's neat to have these kind of unique views. To give you an idea, again, Buffalo was in a position to do this because we were the 8th largest city in the United States by 1901. Detroit was our biggest competition for the exposition, and they did put up a good fight, but Buffalo in the end was able to position themselves more. This electric tower, to give you an idea of scale and size, it stood actually taller than City Hall stands in today's skyline. So you can imagine on a farm property that never had anything on it, except for the Park Country Club basically at that time, which became the Women's Pavilion. To see something like this, I'm from Gasport, hometown originally, and I still live there. And in 1901, you could have taken a train to the Pan American Exposition, but in your life, even though electricity had been coming, alternating current, which was another reason why we got the exposition, from Niagara Falls, from 1895, most people would never have experienced electric power. Can you imagine what it would be like to come to something like this for the first time of your life, having never experienced electricity ever, and seeing something like this? It's really profound when you think about it. And here's 2 different views that give more of a general view of the exposition. And on the left is a map that shows the grounds. Of course, like here's our building for orientation. And this particular painting was done by H.H. Green, another artist who worked a lot in this area. He's really known for his bird's eye views of the falls. He did this just from his training and perspective and using those architects' renderings. Wine & Johnson was one of the architectural firms that designed at the exposition, and he took their renderings and his training, and he put together this image before the exposition was even built. So this is actually from 1899. So pre-exposition, and that's why the midway is not as articulated there. So all of these things are moving us into, and this is, of course, we have 2 shameless plugs for the History Museum. But this one is one of my favorite artifacts in the collection, and again, one of the things I'd like to be a theme of tonight, and especially because I know from talking to a lot of you coming in tonight, resources. We've mentioned the public library, we've mentioned the TR site. There are all of these resources like the History Museum where repositories of these items are still kept and made accessible. This image was taken by the director of electricity at the exposition, and this is his electric fountain going in, and it must have been a little bit like Las Vegas. It did have colored electrical lights, and it did have water cascades of various heights that was available for people to view. It's called the Rustin Fountain, and it was named for its designer. What makes me super happy is in Mr. Rustin's vanity about his fountain, he captured the History Museum being built. These are the only images we have in the History Museum. The windows are not even in yet. And they did bring George Carey back to do the extensions in 1929. So George Carey did our whole building, which is a little unusual. But you can see how the horticulture building is visible, and then the Women's Pavilion over here. So again, these glimpses in, if it were not for these people who collected and saved and preserved, and these historians, like we're going to transition to some more focused stories here, we would not have and know these things. And what is Buffalo without the character of these stories and these unique assets that we have? So now I'm going to shoot it back over to Doug to take us to our panel.
So what we thought we'd do is invite some people who have specific knowledge sort of to dig into some of those areas of definition. So I'd like to ask Chris Hawley if you'd like to talk about innovation, or however he wants to define that.
Okay, let's see if I can turn on the mic here.
Does that work? Or maybe this one. Yeah.
How is this? Oh, that's fabulous. All right, so my name is Chris Hawley. I'm a local history buff and city planner. And I thought I'd focus just my brief remarks today on 1 slide. So actually I only have 1 slide today, so I'm improving on my brevity. It's my first ever 1-slide presentation. But the reason I have this 1 slide is to focus on one individual, not to recognize the significance of one individual person, but to recognize a person as a symbol of something a little bit larger. And I chose Casimir Masseria as a symbol of the role of working people in building our city and creating for the first time in our country, through the labor movement, a broad-based middle class. And Casimir Masseria is not a name that is familiar to Buffalonians, but one that I think and have a mission to make familiar. He was a 26-year-old decorated World War veteran who was shot dead by Lackawanna Steel Company police. They used to have their own police forces back in those days. During the Great Steel Strike of 1919, he was a US-born citizen of Polish descent who had been working at the Lackawanna Steel Company, at the time it wasn't Bethlehem Steel, for 2 months since his return from France, where he had been serving throughout the war and with distinction with the 2nd Division. On September 23rd, during the Great Steel Strike of 1919, it was a failed strike, by the way. 3,000 strikers assembled at Gate 3, which residents would have called 3 Gate, still called that now. Exactly what followed was never officially determined, but accounts agree that after several strikers began to throw stones, company police randomly fired shotgun shots into a crowd of men, women, and children, instantly killing Casimir Masseria and injuring several others. His funeral procession was the largest in Lackawanna history up to that point. Father Baker's may have been larger. It extended more than a mile down Ridge Road to Holy Cross Cemetery. No serious investigation ever took place into the death of Casimir Masseria, shown here in what is believed to be the only known surviving photograph published in the Buffalo Times. He was a martyr for a failed strike that is marked only by a cemetery stone, which I found recently in Holy Cross Cemetery, a very modest stone. So Casimir Masseria, Great War veteran, the kind of person that we would have celebrated any time in American history, was fairly ruthlessly and instantly killed as part of a relatively peaceful labor strike. In fact, you'll notice back then even relatively peaceful strikes were called riots. Casimir Masseria is not the only person to have lost his life in a labor struggle. He wasn't even the only person to lose his life in this strike. And certainly not the only person to lose his life in a workplace injury, but he is a great symbol, and I think perhaps one of the greatest symbols of the role of working people in building America, often at great personal sacrifice. I think everyone knows that Buffalo was a great hotbed of unionism and labor activism in the early and mid-20th century. And yet, here in Buffalo, not one historic marker, not one monument, not one designated landmark anywhere is dedicated to the labor movement. Isn't that an amazing thing for a city that played such a huge role in creating the labor movement, which uplifted many hundreds of thousands of working people into the middle class in the early to mid 20th century. So this is my proposition, that the role of the blue-collar Joe and Jill now deserves recognition, as we're starting to see in many other regions in the country, places like Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia are doing a lot more these days to honor the contributions and sacrifices of working people in building our country. But there aren't any here, at least not yet. The great events in Buffalo labor history have no official story told for them anywhere in the region. The Buffalo Switchman Strike of 1892, the Great Scooper Strike of 1899, the Steel Strike of 1919, where Casimir Masseria was killed, and the Bethlehem Steel Strike of 1946, the most successful steel strike, the most successful strike in Buffalo history that yielded a meaningful contract for the first time for company employees. There's nothing locally that recognizes what I think is the historical truth in Ralph Chaplin's 1915 Union hymn, Solidarity Forever. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving. It's the wonders that we have made, but the Union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn. But without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. That's my proposition. Thank you.
Now we'd like to ask Mike Vogel to talk about what's going on down at the waterfront. Do you want the? Yeah, I think it'll be easier. This is the
Let me start with an analogy. You've got a group of historians. You may not get out of here alive, but at least we haven't started arguing with each other yet, so you have a chance. I had a Jesuit friend whose theory of sermons was the head can't comprehend more than the bottom can withstand. So we will try to keep it moving longer. What I'm going to try to do is close the circle a little bit here and take a look at the role that history and heritage is playing in the modern Buffalo, looking back and looking forward at the same time. I have a unique position to be able to do that from. Since 1985, I've been the city's lighthouse keeper. It's an anachronistic occupation. Mine is a preservation role rather than a tending of the lights like the old wikis used to do. But it's a great place from the top of that tower to look back in time and look forward in time and enjoy what is happening in Buffalo. When I was a reporter for the news, I did that for reporting and editing for about 43 years. The news in the glory days sent me to more than 40 waterfronts around the world, most around the country, a couple of other countries, to look at what was working and, more importantly, what wasn't working. Talk to activists and planners and city leaders and politicians and people on the street to see what they liked and what they didn't like about how their waterfronts were developing. And that gave me a great deal of perspective. And there were two take-home messages from that whole exercise. One, which seems like a no-brainer today, but wasn't back in the 1980s, is that you have to connect people with the water. They have to be able to get up to the water's edge. If you want an example of how that doesn't work, visit Toronto's waterfront. It's wall-to-wall buildings. They made huge planning mistakes in building their waterfront, and they regret it. They're trying to come up with all kinds of creative ways to get back to that connectivity. The second piece, though, is the one that I really think applies, and that's that the waterfront developments that worked, as opposed to the ones that really failed, and there were many of those. The ones that worked were the waterfronts that told their own story, their own unique narrative. They developed a sense of place. And that is exactly what we're trying to do here in Buffalo right now, is to develop a waterfront with a narrative. And if you do that well, you make that waterfront a destination for tourists to bring in outside income, but you also make it a source of pride for those of us who live here, because we start to rediscover our own story. And I would argue that Buffalo turned its back on its waterfront for most of the 20th century. If you had gone down to the outer harbor when we started our lighthouse restoration back in 1985, it was a wasteland. Aside from small boat usage at what used to be called the small boat harbor, and I will call it that until the day I die, there was nothing. We were on a Coast Guard base, there was nothing in between. It was an industrial wasteland. 10 to 15 years ago, that changed. We reached a tipping point. And I can tell you, Melissa and I have worked on the Knesset History Advisory Group for 3 years now.
And then years before that, and other iterations, I think.
There were other iterations before. It was like pulling teeth to get history and heritage recognized in the waterfront development scheme back then. We have had some successes on it. Melissa and I and a few other historians that served on that committee. It is now embedded, and it's one of the reasons the governor asked me to serve on the ECHDC board of directors, to put a voice for heritage and history into the leadership of that organization. And every document I'm seeing now has a reference, a strong reference to history and heritage at Canalside, so we can tell the story down there, and we'll look at a little bit of that here. Embedded in this is an invitation to a party. If you read the text, and I stole this from one of the sponsored pitch presentations we do for the Tall Ships Festival, but we have a bicentennial coming up, a very important bicentennial in 2025. This is the place where the last shovels of earth were turned and the Erie Canal was completed. was a place of globally important narrative. It was the place where DeWitt Clinton left on a canal boat to go to New York City for the wedding in the waters that linked the heartland of the continent to the eastern seaboard. And often lost in that story is the fact that that canal not only built Buffalo, it catapulted New York City into preeminence as a port on the Atlantic for the United States. New York had trailed Boston and Philadelphia and even Charleston and up until that point. But this canal made Buffalo, but it also made New York. This is a map of the canal system. It's kind of the Venice of North America, if you think about it. This is not even a complete map, but it shows the waterways, and I'm thinking about the 1870s. And you can see all the water features. There were islands. Kelly's Island is a peninsula between an artificial ship canal and the Buffalo River. It's named Kelly's Island because you got to it by boat. It's really got a land connection, but nobody could get there by land. You really ferried across to it. We were very much a maritime port city. We've gotten away from that. And if you look at the numbers, in 1810, before the canal opened, we had 1,508 residents. By 1830, a couple years after the canal opened, 8,668. By 1870, about the time of this map, we had 117,714. That's 80 times in 60 years, 80 times the population of 1810. In 1900, we were at 352,387. And in 1910, a century after that first number, we had 429,715 people. That's a growth. We were 800 times bigger in the course of that century. We grew by 800 times. That's a phenomenal growth, and there are stories embedded in that. One of them is the immigration story that we haven't even touched on tonight, or just touched on briefly. An entire river of humanity coming from the East Coast through that port to the heartlands of the country, settling the heartlands. The other story is commerce. The produce, the products, the timber, the grain, everything that they generated in the heartland coming back through this port, which was a transshipment port where cargoes transferred, creating wealth at this port, and going back to the East Coast. On the docks at Central Wharf, where you can wander now, it's plank docking, there's no building on it yet. But there were two guys that formed a couple of companies there, William Fargo and Henry Wells. Wells Fargo and American Express started on those docks, and we grew from there. This, Melissa will recognize this. This is a call-out map, and you'll see this again eventually. Not tonight, but in another year or two. This is actually a working map right now. This is taken a bird's eye view of Buffalo in the early 1880s. It's a segment of that large panorama of the city taken from a balloon's perspective. And there are a lot of elements in there, but this is the bustling, dense port that we were. In the center is the canal side, the canal district, the infected district, the very nostrils of hell, according to the Christian Homestead Association that did the map that Doug referred to, with 75 brothels, 125 saloons, and 8 or 9, they had a different name then, but what amount to burlesque houses. A place where sailors coming from the inland areas on schooners got paid off, and canalers coming from New York on canal boats got paid off, and they spent their money on what sailors always spend their money on. At this point, where this is a working document, and we are figuring out ways to highlight the surviving elements of the district, of the city from this 1880s map. There aren't many, but there are some. And you will see this eventually in 7 by 30 foot size, mounted on an abutment of the skyway down at Canal Side, with a "You Are Here" and a chance to look at important buildings from the past and buildings that exist, still survive in the future. This is the trade routes. We're now about in the 1940s. This is the flow of goods that made Buffalo what it was, that grew it into the 8th largest city in the country. Grain. This is late in the canal era. The tiny line that goes across the canal system is generally some grain, but other bulk cargoes. But at this point in time, in the New York State barge canal era, it was largely stone, the cheapest of commodities, because the railroads had taken all the trade. But basically, not too far from here in Forest Lawn, there's a tombstone that marks the grave of a man who was a founding father of the city of Buffalo, Judge Samuel Wilkinson. And on that tombstone, the two words engraved on that tombstone are Urban Condita. He built the city in Latin. And he didn't build it directly. He built the port, and the port built the city. This was hugely important through time. And it's still important today. We still get cargo ships in. This is American Mariner, the largest regularly scheduled freighter to visit our harbor several times a season. It carries as much as a dozen or more of the old style freighters used to carry, coming down Lighthouse Point, and it's still an important thing, but we're transitioning. We're transitioning to a recreational harbor. This is the view from the lantern room at the top of the tower, the 1833 tower, and it shows powerboats, the city panorama behind it. Our harbor is still developing, and I'm pleased to see that heritage has become part of that narrative, but there is a lot of space out there. A major citizen push now that Canalside and ECHDC are hearing to preserve green space and open spaces on the outer harbor. Very happy to be a part of that. We have actually two lighthouses. We have the 1833 at the north entrance to your left, and we actually own the South Buffalo Lighthouse in that gap next to Bethel and Steel. We're starting the restoration of that. Wedding of the Waters 2025 marks the 200th anniversary of that. And that has become a theme for our harbor development. We are pushing toward that date because we know we'll have to host a major party for that. One of the major elements for that, as Melissa mentioned, John Montague and Buffalo Maritime Center are building an Erie Canal packet boat. The committee that we serve on identified that as a priority project. The idea had been languishing for 2 decades, but we identified it as something we wanted to put in as a signature element at Canalside. After starting in April, we'll be looking at starting construction of the building, a long shed. It'll have a name, but for now it's just called a long shed. To build that packet boat in. It's a replica of the Seneca Chief it's as close as we can get in terms of historical research. And it will take 3 years, which is a lot longer than it should take, but it's a public participation project. We want you to be able to go down there, help build the boat if you want, talk to the builders, look at the interpretive displays, get an idea of the history that we're dealing with down there.
And just another plug for those colleague organizations. If you haven't been to the Maritime Center, they do have their main operation on Arthur Street, and they do so many great things with hands-on programs. So it'll be great to have this other piece now. And it's amazing that very few of these boats, considering how many there were, even remain. So to be able to have one back for people to learn from and experience will be really great.
This will be the best replica historically, the most accurate replica of an early period canal boat. And it'll be a roving ambassador for Buffalo along the route of the canal as well as being an interpretive element in Canalside most of the time. And the Buffalo Maritime Center, I understand, is going to be featured in the Buffalo News tomorrow with a photo display, so you get an idea of what they're about. My personal baby is the Buffalo Lighthouse, the 1833 lighthouse, actually the second lighthouse in Buffalo. The 1818 was the first American lighthouse lit on the Great Lakes, and we're working to interpret that because we just got past that bicentennial. And we have pretty much completed the restoration of this tower, which started in 1985 with, just seems like 1885. Started in 1985 because the Coast Guard was really concerned about structural cracks and they were worried about collapse. We've got it relit. We're now in private aided navigation, but it's the icon of Buffalo history. We use it for a lot of activities. Jazz at the Lighthouse on the lower left, concert bands, tours, school groups. It's incorporating history. It's telling the story of Buffalo to a new generation. And I think...
Top button will take it.
Okay. I think that may be it. The other thing that we're doing, though, just to get into another shameless plug, the Lighthouse Association, which is a small nonprofit, we're taking a huge risk and bringing a Tall Ships Festival to Buffalo July 4th through 7th. We'll have a dozen sailing ships of the type that, most of them are the type that used to grace the Great Lakes, fill the Great Lakes with commerce. There are historical accounts of the lake white with sail. We're bringing 12 of them, very, very large ships back in, and doing programming around them, and a parade of sail on the Outer Harbor on July 4th, and then festivals on 5, 6, 7. If you want more detail on that, portofcallbuffalo.org. Tickets are on sale, and there's still a few ship sponsorships available if you have a lot of disposable income. So with that, I will just say stay tuned for that party in 2025. It's already being planned.
So, and then we'll ask, to sort of wrap up our portion, we'll ask Steve Cichon, talk a little bit about people, how that impacted us in the last century.
So I'm glad Doug mentioned earlier about Newport, Rhode Island. Anybody been to Newport, Rhode Island? I've been to Newport, Rhode Island, and when I went there, of course it's gorgeous, and we talk about the robber barons, and we look at all the great architecture. And one of the houses had a very well interpreted and very well restored kitchen. And there was nothing other than just, oh, this is the kitchen. And we went back up and talked about where the Rockefellers were, and where JFK had breakfast once and all that. But the kitchen is where my people would have been. And I want to know more about the people who were in the kitchen, which sort of reinvigorated me to be sort of a pop culture historian, which really means just the stuff that any of us are going to tell stories about. When you tell a story about something that happened in your past, you are in a story. You're talking about history. You're talking about the things of the past. So those are the things that I like to talk about. And to sort of talk about how that works into what we've been talking about this evening, I'm going to highlight seven people. They happen to be males because there really aren't too many stories of females through those years. But these are 7 guys. And here's a guy. Which one of these is my pointer? Right there in the middle. There's a guy right there. His name is Joseph P. Greiner. He's the grandson of German immigrants who came to Buffalo in the 1820s. His great aunt was one of the first people baptized as a Roman Catholic in the city of Buffalo. He was one of Buffalo's first electricians. If you go through the 1901, 1902 city directory, his job title is actually listed as electrician, which is kind of neat in Buffalo, in the city of Light. But there's a Joseph P. Greiner who lived in also what is now Buffalo's medical complex area, the medical campus. He was just one of the German immigrants kind of toiling as an electrician and as a laborer in one of the grain mills in that area. And we had a photo here, but so we're going to talk about Thomas Slattery, who happens to not have his photo here, but he was a lake boat captain. He's the son of Irish immigrants, came to Buffalo through Canada as an Irish immigrant, started off as a very low-level sailor, worked his way up to become a sea captain, captain on the Great Lakes, and was actually one of Fingy Connor's favorite guys, and ended up running one of his favorite passenger boats that ran from Buffalo all the way through the Great Lakes, and that was Captain Thomas Slattery. Julius Wargo, this guy right here, this is him looking as sharp as he ever did on his wedding day. He was a Hungarian immigrant who came to Buffalo and worked at the Republic Steel plant in South Buffalo. Henry Lower was the son of German immigrants. He was actually a German immigrant himself. His father was a tailor set up on Jefferson Street on Buffalo's east side. He grew to become a morning city court judge. There are all kinds of great stories about him dealing with those guys who were down in the hooks and people who were in the drunk tanks all around the city. But he was the one who was dealing with those guys, a judge here in the city of Buffalo. And Patrick Coyle, don't have a photo of him, but he was the son of Irish immigrants. Came to Buffalo from Pennsylvania, and he really moved his way up in the world because his father, an Irish immigrant, was someone who worked on a farm. The farm didn't work out so well, so he ended up being a coal miner. Patrick was a coal miner for a little while, but decided to move on up and got a really great job at Lackawanna Steel and was able to provide for his family here in a way that he couldn't as a coal miner in rural Pennsylvania. Jan Cichon here is a guy who came to Buffalo from Poland and ended up working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week as a boxcar packer, and pretty much worked that way until he died to provide for his 10 kids. Just a quick glance at 7 men who kind of make up some of the story of Buffalo. They all also happen to be my grandparents. These are all my grandfathers, except for this, I was going to lie and say they were all my grandfathers. The judge was not my grandfather. The judge was an uncle who was acting as a grandfather. The family historian is here, so I couldn't get away with it. I didn't know he was going to show up. Henry Lower was a great uncle who acted as a grandfather, but all these guys are my grandfathers. All 4 of my grandparents were from Buffalo. All 8 of my great-grandparents were from Buffalo, and 11 of my 16 great-great-grandparents were from Buffalo. The reason I say that is because their story is my story. The reason that I'm here talking about Buffalo's history is because of all of those stories, and all those guys who came from all these different places all around the world and wound up here in Buffalo. The land of opportunity, the land of those bright lights that we saw from the halfway across the city. Buffalo is the land of opportunity and a place where the history of these men and hundreds of thousands of others like them are sort of the foundation for the history of things we're talking about. Things that, as historians in Buffalo, we really couldn't talk about. 10 years ago, if I would mention Bethlehem Steel, and I did, in a group of people like this, you would just hear this sort of collective, oh, right? Mention Bethlehem Steel 10 years ago, you couldn't mention, people would just the thought of it made people sick and angry, and thinking about, this is Buffalo, and we're terrible. We've turned some kind of corner where we can actually talk about our history, talk about our personal history, and I think that it's a solid foundation for our future. The greatest thing about Buffalo, we talk about the great buildings and the great architecture and the great things that have happened here, but I think it's our people that have always been what attract people to this place. Whether they're new and they've come from somewhere else, or you live in Buffalo and you move away, you've got to come back because of the people who are here. And it's a great foundation, and it's a great way to think about our future, is having that solid base in the past. When we build out Canal Side and we think about not just rebuilding what used to be there, but making that part of what it is going forward, taking those threads and weaving it into that fabric. When we think about the medical campus, and think about the fact that that was once Buffalo's brewing center, and we think about Larkinville and how that what we call Larkinville was once an industrial center and had so many different things going on in the hydraulics neighborhood. Taking those elements and weaving them into our future is really what makes the past exciting for me, and why I like to tell the stories of Buffalo's past, not just to be nostalgic or not just to think about how great things used to be, but how we can weave those into our future and make sure that that past greatness is part of our future greatness as well. So that's all I have, and I'm supposed to turn it over now for questions. What do you think?
Yeah. I like the last image, so I'm just going to park it there. I'm excited that we went an hour and 15 minutes and talk about the McKinley assassination. Where's one for the group? Climate change. How's climate change going to impact us going forward? So I suppose, Michael, since it's going to be the water coming up the steps, we'll start with you. I'm hogging the mic.
Okay, I just happen to have covered the very first International Climate Change Conference in Toronto way back when. It's going to affect us. It's going to affect the Great Lakes in ways we don't really understand yet. Climate change has a lot of broad brush predictions, but when you get down to the local level, it is a lot more uncertain. So likely what we're going to see is some difference in lake levels that could affect our waterfront. We will see probably, and I think we're already starting to see that, more frequent and stronger storms embedded in general slight warming of the Great Lakes. And I think we're going to see a lot of demand from other parts of the country for siphoning off water from the Great Lakes, the freshwater system. All of that will have huge macroeconomic impacts on this area. Depending on the impacts on other parts of the country, there's a chance Buffalo could become a destination city for people trying to get away from the seacoasts and a lot of the storm intensities that may develop in the south. But really way too early to see how exactly that's going to play out for Buffalo, either in our own climate effects or in the economic patterns that will change. There's just so much uncertainty on how people will move, how the economies will be impacted by that sort of thing. We can say that, yes, man is having an impact on the climate. It will vary from region to region, and a lot of that will just take a little bit more time to play out before we're really going to handle on it.
Anybody else on that?
Sure, I think one immediate impact that we've seen in Buffalo and in Western New York is the weather. And we've seen snowstorms. We've seen the freak snowstorm that crippled South Buffalo a couple of years ago that nobody knew was going to happen. And as we see more of those sorts of events, I think it allows us, with hopes of mitigating the effects of climate change, I think the more Buffalo-type weather we have, the more chance for us to put our Buffalo-ness in the national spotlight. When we had that tremendous storm in South Buffalo, the image that was resounding in the national newscast wasn't the fact that we had all that snow, wasn't the fact that all the problems that we had. It was the 6 firefighters carrying the man down Abbott Road on a stretcher to get him to Mercy Hospital. And we're Buffalonians, and I think we like to think that we're special, but I think we are special. And there aren't too many places where, if we're going to take some positive away from climate change, I think it allows us to put our Buffalo-ness on display. If Buffalo-ness is a word, there's probably a better word for it, but I think you all know what I'm talking about.
So you hashtag the evening.
I was going to say
Hashtag Buffalo-ness.
it is now to be on a t-shirt on your way out.
I'll add one more thing to that, just because I'm thinking about, in terms of how history has predicted the future. I'm reminded of Yogi Berra's quote, prediction is very hard, especially about the future. And there was a time in Buffalo's history when the Buffalo Chamber of Commerce, labor unions, and all 3 papers thought that the St. Lawrence Seaway was going to be a boon for our port activities. It obviously was not. And there are predictions now that Buffalo could benefit from climate change. And I think that we should be very skeptical of those claims and definitely try to be prepared for worst case scenarios.
We spent a lot of time talking about waterfront, the canal. That's sort of been our theme in the 1800s. One of the things we've neglected, it's been on the edges, but is this whole idea of rail. At dinner we were talking about the fact that back in the day, Melissa could have gotten here easier from Gasport on a train than she can on the 990 today. That people from my neck of the woods came to the Pan on special rails on the New York Central Railroad. Railroad infrastructure. We talk about the new downtown station. We talk about, wringing our hands. What do we do about Central Terminal? What about rail transportation going into the 21st century?
It's an interesting question, and at one time Buffalo was the 3rd busiest rail hub in the nation, and that infrastructure still exists, although some tracks are being abandoned here and there. Railroads are basically wanting to get out from under the carrying costs of the land that the rails are on. One initiative that sort of links very strongly into the heritage and history theme that we're doing today is the reclamation of the old Buffalo Kohler Corporation site on Lee Street, across the Buffalo River from the Tesla factory. That is evolving as a hub of small history-related nonprofits. Right now the Steel Museum is in there, the Lighthouse Association has its offices there. There is a Railroad Museum and the Buffalo Irish Genealogical Society is there, and a few others are heading into there. And they're gathering in the archives of all these, of the major rail lines that are running out of storage space for them. I'm very happy to find someone to take them. So that's becoming a major research center in the buildings that exist. The build-out long-term is to take some of their rolling stock. They have 50 to 60 cars, a couple of locomotives, things like Dwight Eisenhower's campaign car, and a lot of stuff that's being restored. And there's a lot of interest in developing rail links through that hub from Niagara Falls, where just recently Canada pushed through its commuter line in Niagara Falls, Ontario, with a provision that allows them to cross the border with one customs check. So they can pick up rail on this side, come down to Buffalo, trains would connect to the Ellicottville ski areas, the Sabres and the Bills venues, and then down to Jamestown, where there are southern tier cities that are really interested in this. Jamestown with its National Comedy Center and the major restoration they did on their rail terminal, and then across to Corning rather, and that discussions are being made. It is a matter of certifying rail cars to make that start to happen, but don't rule rail out in the future in this area. It's still there, and right now the freight lines dominate and passenger trains take second place, but that could change in the future.
Another question we had that I wanted to start out, the question is just, could you speak about the Skyway, is the question. And I want to start this one by, there's a historian of some renown that we have his collection. It was actually purchased by M&T Bank, well, Buffalo Savings Bank, for the History Museum as part of the bicentennial, and that's Roy Nagel. His collection and his photo collection forms a big part of our collection. And he was our first Red Jacket recipient at the Buffalo History Museum, which an award that goes back for civic devotion to 1958. He was our first recipient in 1958. And he gives this address. Roy Nagel was a historian that was actually on the payroll of the bank. And they hired him out to do talks in the community. And according to him, he did like 6,000 of these talks in the community about Buffalo history. And this is in the periods of the 40s and 50s and 60s. And he gave an address about the Skyway. So the Skyway is built and it opens in 1955. And he gives this wonderful talk about, he's looking at it as a beacon of progress. And he's like, Buffalo is really clicking. We're really clicking all these things. We've got the Skyway, we've got all these things happening here, and look at all the energy. And at the end, and I'm paraphrasing this, I'm just remembering from what I've read before, but he says, the only thing we have to do is get the word out about Buffalo. And it always struck me as, again, one of these things of these messages kind of hitting you and coming back where you've heard this before, we're dealing with it now. I know there's been a lot of talk about the Skyway. I mean, like you mentioned it, with dealing with the abutments and putting the basically public art on the abutments. There's talk about, should the Skyway stay, should the Skyway go? I personally, that vista that you see, it's just distracting when you're driving because you want to look at the water. But what do you all think? Could you speak about the Skyway?
Personally, and I don't know how this will be received, because usually people look at me crazy. I think it's beautiful. I do. I think that the Skyway, the same way that I find grain elevators beautiful, the same way that I find some of the decrepit buildings around Buffalo that we all fight to save. There's a beauty in the Skyway. There's a beauty in the engineering of it. At the time, Roy Nagel wasn't the only one. I just wrote a couple weeks ago a story that basically just takes the newspapers, the Courier Express and the Buffalo Evening News, from the day the Skyway opened, talking about this majestic, amazing marvel of engineering. And it really was, when you think about all of our highways. To be able to drive on the 90 from Boston to Seattle is amazing. It's a modern engineering marvel that we kind of take for granted. Now, whether or not it should stay here in 2019, if we have better options or not, but I think it is important to appreciate to not just talk about it being sort of the brick wall between the water and the rest of, what's going on in the waterfront. But I think it's to appreciate what it is important. And I do think it's kind of pretty, which is a little
It
strange.
doesn't surprise me that I would think that that would be something carried across this group. And I think back to Mike's point earlier as well, that in terms of it being a barrier, whether there is another option or other options to be considered, what's really interesting is because of the work at Canal Side and other things, I mean, we are activating the water. It's not a barrier to activating the waterfront. It's about showing people how to get there, first of all. I mean, the wayfinding has been really challenging, and those types of things have been improving. So, aside from that and kind of taking the Skyway for what it is, there's also other activities that are happening that people are making their way down the Canal Side and finding their way and navigating better. And there's still more improvement to be done there. And Chris, you had something?
No, I have second comments that are positive about the Skyway. I mean, I think that one of the great things about New York State, and the reason it became the Empire State, was because of its commitment to great public works. And there are very few places in New York State where different eras of great civic optimism are on full display. You have the Erie Canal, the New York Central Railroad, and the Buffalo Skyway, all in the same location. That's a pretty powerful statement about the New York state of mind. And whether it stays, I think, is certainly going to be subject to a lot of contention over the next few years. My personal take is that regardless of whether it's kept as a road, and maybe it should. I've never driven a day in my life. I don't know how to drive. But wouldn't it be amazing if it were kept as an elevated park?
Yeah.
And I think that would be interesting too. And that might be something to discuss.
Are there any other questions? We're ready to wrap up. So, Dr. Mann?
Yeah, I guess. So I want to thank our panelists and our keynote speakers for their contributions to our education and development here at Medaille College. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We always talk about how no matter what the weather is, it's an excuse not to come. So thank you for being here. Look forward to seeing you again in October at our next Buffalo Futures series. Thank you very much.